nature is fractal in its structure. What that means is that a pattern occurring on a given scale can be expected to occur on other scales, very different. Simple example, an atom is a nucleus with electrons spinning around it. A solar system is a star with atoms spinning around it. A galaxy is a huge black hole and the agglomeration of stars within the outlying neighborhood spiraling around it. These are things on tremendously different scales, and yet they are organized similarly. And so I believe this is how nature works. Once she finds a pattern that works, she applies it in many domains of temperature, pressure, and cosmic scaling. So this cosmological constant, omega, which says that the universe is expanding faster and faster, throws a kind of umbrella of political correctness over my notion that we are moving faster and faster into novelty, and that we are, as it were, simply the dust motes or the magnetic particles in the presence of some kind of field phenomenon which is organizing us to its will. And this is the source of my optimism. If I had to place my faith in human institutions, human religions, human goodness, the human capacity for decency and dignity, I would be absolutely in the depths of existential despair, as I was as a kid. Because as a kid, I didn't have these ideas. I had Camusian existentialism and Nietzschean whining and all the rest of it. And it's a pretty grim situation, folks. But I really believe that without atom smashers, without long base interferometers and all the rest of it, you can go into nature and open your eyes and open your mind, and you will see these processes in play, and you can easily extrapolate them to your own life. Now, if going into nature and opening your eyes and paying attention doesn't deliver this to you, then I suggest 20 milligrams of psilocybin be added into the mix, or 200 micrograms of LSD, or something like that, and then I think it will come shining through. Why should that be necessary? Why should someone have to resort to what Rimbaud called an artificial perturbation of the senses to achieve this? Simply because culture mitigates against it. Culture is a closed system of thinking and values of the sort I am denouncing. And it is the greatest barrier to your enlightenment, your education, and your decency is your culture. And I realize with joy that here I skirt the bounds of political correctness, because everyone is running around saying, recapture your roots, get in touch with your Swedishness, your Irishness, your whatever-ishness, and that's all very fine, but I think it's your humanness that may have eluded you in all this ethnocentric breastfeeding. Well, why should culture imprison us and somehow place a barrier between ourselves and our true humanness? Well, I think I said at the beginning of this thing, culture and ideology are not your friends. They are not your friends. This is a hard thing to come to terms with, because a certain kind of alienation lies at the end of this thought process. On the other hand, you can't live in the cradle forever. You can't be clueless forever. So somebody might as well just lay it out for you and say, culture is for the convenience of culture, not you. How many times have your sexual desires, career aspirations, financial dealings, and aesthetic inclinations been squashed, twisted, rejected, and minimized by cultural values? And if you don't think culture is your enemy, ask the 18-year-old kid who is given a rifle and sent to the other side of the world to murder strangers if culture is his friend. These extreme examples should bring it home to us that it's a kind of a con game. It is, in fact, strangely enough, a kind of virtual reality. We have been led to think of virtual realities as something on the screen of a computer or presented through a headset, but that's an electronic virtual reality. The primary technology for the building of virtual realities is language. Once you start talking about race pride, loyalty, our destiny, our God, our mission, it's like building virtual realities. And people begin to treat these things as though they had the substantiality of real objects, and to build their lives as though these things were real. And what is this? It's a diminution of humanness. You're choosing to limit yourself to a cultural reality, whether it's the reality of being Witoto or Orthodox Jewish or whatever it is. It's a smaller world than the simple hardware you were born into this universe with. And the substances, the drugs, the plants, the things which perturb consciousness, they don't address cultural values. They blast through them. They address the animal body, the mammalian brain. They perturb these information fields outside of the relativistic set of values that the culture is giving you. This is why people who yearn for legal psychedelics have not thought, in my opinion, deeply enough about what is really at stake here. Imagine a culture so certain of its primary values, so sure that it represented the right way to live, that it would encourage people to take psychedelic substances and examine its premises. There ain't such, at least not in the high-tech industrial democracies or the fascist states either. Some Aboriginal cultures have this courage, but it has kept them very close to the breast of nature and her processes. Cultures that have habitually broken down the cultural illusion and examined the terrifying reality beyond it have not marched off then to pontificate with religions of absolutism or scientific absolutism or all the rest of it. Well, why is that? It's because cultures are virtual realities made of language, and if there is one thing psychedelics do, whether you hate them, whether you love them, whether you don't give a hoot, what they do is they dissolve boundaries. The boundaries between you and the floor, between you and your friend, between you and you last week, and you next week, and they dissolve boundaries. That's what they do. That is the ultimately subversive behavior. Cultures are boundary-defining engines. That's what they do. They teach you, we do it this way. Don't go there in your mind, in your heart. Follow the rules. Follow the rules. Cultures are like operating systems. You know, at Ur and Ur will do. They set up a stela in the center of the marketplace. And on the stela they carved the laws. These were the laws of the operating system called Ur 1.0. And that worked fine for a while. Now we're operating under Clinton's second term 4.0. And is it limiting? Is it idiotic? Is it a pain in the rear end? You bet it is. How can we overcome the limitation of our operating system? Well, basically, what I do with my computer when it acts up is I give it a good slap or a thump on the top. And that's what these psychedelics are doing. They're saying, you know, get it in context, my dear primate. See, how does it all fit together? Every culture in history, in every time and every place, has operated from the assumption that it had it 95% correct and that the other 5% would arrive in 5 years' time. All were wrong. All were wrong, and we gaze back at their naivete with a faint sense of our own superiority. But we're wrong. We don't have it either. I mean, if this is a culture approaching the truth, who needs the truth? I mean, this is something very, very different. Well, then, just to satisfy myself, I asked the question, why should it be like this? Why should these psychedelics, which granted perturb the mind, be such a terrifying contracultural force? And what does that mean? Well, I think it works something like this. Your sensory apparatus connected up to your local language is a very good threat detection device. And that is really what the animal body evolved to be. We wouldn't be here if we weren't at the end of a long line of superb threat detection devices which told us when the saber-toothed carnivore was sneaking on its belly through the tall grass, which gave us that moment out of the corner of our eye when we saw the edge movement and scampered back into the cave, and so forth and so on. So ordinary consciousness has evolved an extraordinary fit to three-dimensional space and time, because that's where your soma, your meat, is. And if the meat is disrupted radically, the mind is, we don't know where. That's somebody else's lecture. It's very important to keep the physical body together. So the mind, under the influence of culture and cultural values, evolves as a threat detection device. But notice that carried far enough, that ends in paranoia. So then, in a sense, all cultural values carried to their ultimate end produce the paranoid personality. Fearful, watchful, never resting, never sleeping, always looking for the worst in every situation. But the mind is like water. It takes the shape of the vessel into which it is poured, always. So when we approach the psychedelic plants as shamans, as seekers, as sincere people interested in extraordinary experiences, what the psychedelics do, I think, is dissolve this three-dimensional threat detection, psychology, and system, and it's as though the mind discovers that it has a second conformational geometry. That's a way of putting it. And this second conformational geometry is of a higher dimensional order than ordinary consciousness. Not as a metaphor, higher dimensional order, but as a mathematician would use that term. The psychedelic mind is a higher dimensional mind. It is not fit for three-dimensional space-time filled with roving, heavy-bodied carnivores. But it is fit for the back of the cave, the mountain retreat, the monastic tower. In other words, the place where threat has been eliminated and philosophy is the order of the day. And so my interpretation of these psychedelic states is that they are actually higher dimensional states of consciousness. And I put this to Ralph Abraham, the mathematician, who is no mathematical slouch and no psychedelic slouch either. And we talked of this in relationship to DMT. And he said, I have no doubt at all that when I am flashing on DMT, I am seeing the ordinary world from a higher dimensional mathematical perspective. And one of the things about higher dimensions is that the linearity of time is overcome. And last week and next week are as easily available as the present moment. The front of my hand is as easily seen as the back of my hand without moving my hand if I am in hyperspace. So in a way, these higher dimensions are the places from which knowledge has percolated. And shamans, related to the smith, the worker in metal, the technologist, the tool maker. These are the twin brothers, the two aspects of the shaman. The shaman is a master of fire, master of metals, maker of tools, seer into the future, so forth and so on. The shaman is outside of cultural time and is, I don't like this word, but channeling the future which is to come in the form of technologies, innovations, languages, behaviors, so forth and so on. And this is why the shaman has always been the paradigmatic figure for Aboriginal cultures, because the shaman knows more, and the method of the shaman has always been perturbation of consciousness. Not always psychedelic plants or substances. Can be hooking metal hooks under your pectoral muscles and hanging for 14 hours in the sun. Can be abandonment in the wilderness. Can be extreme forms of fasting. Can be ordeal poisons. But people are not fools. All of these things are extremely risky and unpleasant, while the psychedelics are the most effective and the least invasive. I mean, let's take 30 milligrams of psilocybin or a great fistful of mushrooms. 3 hours into it, you are definitely thrown into the lap of God. 8 hours into it, you're simply looking back on it, reflecting, drawing conclusions, and wondering where do you go from here. So this is a roundabout way of explaining. It's no surprise to me that society is very nervous around this issue, because society's eggs are all in one basket, and the psychedelically inspired citizen or the psychedelically inspired shaman is a dangerous force. Even in traditional societies, the shaman is central to the social functioning and the health and so forth, but is never allowed to be physically central. There's a leader, a headman or something. The shaman lives off at the edge of the village, sometimes off in the woods. He is approached with fear and trembling. He is loathed and respected and feared and loved, because it is understood that he represents a dimension that nevertheless must be tolerated, because it is the channel through which knowledge and healing and higher values come. Now, in a society like ours, we say we have other methods. We don't need the ravings of intoxicated shamans. We have the scientific method. We have the gospel. We have the Talmud. We have all of these things, and they are sufficient for us to guide ourselves. But to guide ourselves where? The 20th century, if the 20th century is a statement of the accomplishments of the Western mind, values, and methods, then God help us. Because the 20th century is a disgrace, and to this moment, a disgrace. It was so comfortable to look back at Auschwitz and say, well, the 30s, the 40s, Hitler, those gray, grainy movies, this has nothing to do with us. This is just some terrible thing that happened in Europe 50 years ago. No. This is happening. It's happening as we speak. People are being pushed into boxcars and taken away to be lined up and shot for no reason whatsoever, while glasses tinkle and toasts are made by those who define themselves as the preservers of freedom, dignity, and Western value. We haven't learned anything. The 20th century is the most condemnatory piece of evidence you can place against the Western mind, and it seems to me it's a knockout punch. I don't know who's responsible for this, but whoever is responsible is guilty of crimes against humanity. How do we overcome this? How do we find real values? Well, we find them in caring for the earth. Nature presents an established set of processes and achievements, billions of years old, which exercise a moral claim on rational intelligence, if it will but notice. And so that's what this is all about.